These guys who, in my opinion, are the kings of talk radio. These guys did it right most of the time. But by doing it right most of the time means that they stumbled mercilessly or horribly some of the time. The first one I'll talk about is a guy. In fact, if any of you who have been in my studio see that I've got a 8.5 by 11 glossy of him right next to my microphone, and that's the great Art Bell. Art Bell was the king of late night talk radio. First there was Tom Snyder, I guess. Then there was Larry King, and then there was nobody until Art Bell. And I first heard of Art Bell years and years and years ago. I was at a trade show in Las Vegas, and a group of us went out for dinner the night before, and the boss had told me, look, if you go out with these guys, with these salespeople, whatever you do, do not pick up the tab, because that goes on my budget, and I didn't budget for it. If you're going to go out and spend money with these guys, make sure they pick up the tab. So a group of us went out. We went out to, I think it was Benihana's, that was located in the Las Vegas Hilton at that time. Had a great time, dinner, drinks. A great time was had by all. And one of my colleagues had a bit much to drink. In fact, he had more than a bit much to drink. He had way too much to drink. But we were just walking to our rooms. We weren't driving because we were staying in the Las Vegas Hilton. So no harm, no foul. And when the check came, he picked it up. And I nudged him. I said, hey, you know what the boss said? Don't pick up these tabs. He doesn't have money in his budget. And at that time, we didn't have a budget. And my buddy, who was older than me and needed a job at least as bad as I did, said, I don't care about him. F him. I was looking for a job before I got this one. If he fires me, he fires me. I don't even care. And it's kind of what he would have told the boss, and he would have gotten fired. So what did I do? I took the check and I paid it to help my buddy get out of the jam. And I sat in the room that night wondering, what kind of story can I give the boss as to the reason I picked up this tab without throwing my buddy under the bus? So I didn't sleep. And here it is, 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm still not asleep. I got to get up at 6 a.m. to work a trade show. So what do I normally do when I can't sleep? I turn on the local radio station. Again, this was in the 1980s, okay? So there was no internet to speak of. And I heard a local guy broadcasting on KDWN out of Las Vegas. And this guy was talking about UFOs and Bigfoot, and the guy was amazingly entertaining. His name was Art Bell, and he had not been syndicated at that time. He was just a local talk show host in Las Vegas. But Bell was a radio head from youth. Okay, I was hooked. And when he became syndicated about a year later, and in St. Louis, he was on the old KSD 550 AM. But he was always a radio guy from a teenager. He was a ham operator. When he joined the military, he was in the Air Force. He worked for a radio station in Okinawa. Multiple wives, most of them Asian, often much, much younger than he was. Finally, he tried to settle down in the early 80s. He got married, had a family, settled down to try to make some real money to support a family, and he got involved in the cable TV installation business. Made great money. In fact, he was making $100,000 a year, Bell was, in the 1980s. That was great money in the 1980s. But he quit because he couldn't stand it. He quit, left his family, moved to Pahrump. Actually, his wife left him because he quit his job. He quit a $100,000 a year job to take a job making about $12,000 a year doing radio. So his wife left him. He moved to Pahrump, Nevada, and worked overnights for this Las Vegas radio station, okay, and for Chicken Feed. And that's where he met his next wife, Ramona, who was also a broadcaster. At that time, his show was actually political, right center talk. And then he started talking about stuff from Area 51, UFOs, Bigfoot, and the show took off. Then came syndication. And he started to do the show instead of from Las Vegas because he had to drive from Pahrump. What was that, like a 90-minute drive every day over a mountain? But he started doing the syndicated show from his double-wide trailer in Pahrump, Nevada, which just added to the aura of his show. In fact, he used to market the show as from not far from Area 51. Well, it was kind of far from Area 51, but it was in the Nevada desert, okay? But he made big money. But Bell never really changed much. He never moved from the double-wide trailer. With the big money he bought for he and Ramona, his wife, his and her Chevy Geos. That was the most money most money he really spent on cars. He bought a radio station, KNYE in Pahrump. Built it, had his wife run it. Started doing Dreamland on Monday night. So he worked all the time, 4 or 5 hours a night. In fact, if you remember, those of you who listened to Art Bell during the early years, Bell would go ahead and do a show, and he would, so he's supposed to sign off at, I think the show ran from 11 at night local time to 5 in the morning. No, midnight to 5 in the morning. And then sometimes he'd just do an extra hour. Because he said, yeah, I know most people just run, especially on the West Coast where it wasn't 5 in the morning, it was 3 in the morning. They just run the first hour again. He'd just do an extra hour of the show. Then he had the Dreamland show, and he wrote books. He was always, always, always working. He made big money. Then he just quit all of a sudden. And when he quit, there were all types of rumors about how Bell was involved in a child abuse scandal, okay? And that wasn't the case at all. In fact, the case actually was his son, Art Bell IV, had been sexually molested by a teacher. And so all people saw was Art Bell, sex abuse, underage. And they assumed that it was the broadcaster. Well, he quit, didn't say anything because he didn't want to bring his kid into the spotlight. Later it came out as to what the true story was. He sued the individual successfully who fabricated the story, and he was back on the air. But then he quit again, and then he was back again. Then he quit again, then he was back again. His wife, Ramona, he and her went on a vacation in their RV. And Ramona died of an asthma attack, which Bell was a chain smoker, and Ramona died of an asthma attack. You'd think that he wouldn't smoke around her. Maybe he didn't. I don't know. But shortly after she died, I mean, it was a matter of maybe a couple of months, he remarried another Asian woman. In fact, this was someone he met online in the Philippines. And he broadcasted a while from Manila, Philippines. And then finally he was just done. He quit. He broadcast on Sirius XM for a while, for 6 weeks, a show called Dark Matter, Art Bell's Dark Matter. Only lasted 6 weeks, but didn't like the connection that he was getting with the feed, so he quit. He then started Midnight in the Desert, an internet radio show, bankrolled with his own money. Quit because he thought people were shooting at him on his way from one double-wide trailer to the next. A little background on that. Art Bell lived in I don't want to call it a trailer park. It was but I guess it was kind of a trailer park, okay? But every lot had close to a half acre of ground, okay? And he would put up these big towers that would interfere with people's electric in their house. So Bell basically just bought the whole trailer park, and he owned it all. So his broadcast studio was actually in a different house because by this time he had a wife and a kid, and he broadcast in the middle of the night, didn't want to bother them, but he thought people were shooting at him when he was walking from one trailer to the other. So he quit. Art Bell had COPD, he had back pain, and he died shortly thereafter of an overdose of a cocktail of various painkiller drugs. Some people say he was a drug addict. George Knapp, who worked with Bell and was his friend, basically said, look, here's the deal. Bell was in excruciating pain. By taking these painkiller drugs, it enabled him to have something of a life. He made a mistake, he took too many, and he died. I mean, he wrote books, he was on television, he was very, very successful. But at the time of his death, he was worth $10 million. Art Bell, the king of talk radio, was truly a pioneer. Speaking of painkiller type drugs and opioids, the next topic, or the next person I'm going to talk about is Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh, from Cape Girardeau, Missouri, where I was this week, earlier in the week. He was from an educated family, but dropped out of Southeast Missouri State after 2 semesters. I mean, his grandfather was a judge, a prosecutor, a Missouri State senator. His father was a lawyer. His uncle and his cousin were federal judges. So, what did Rush Limbaugh do? He dropped out of high school, or dropped out of college, and worked at radio DJ jobs. And he started out in Cape Girardeau, and he basically moved from town to town to town, getting little DJ job after little non-paying DJ job. Couldn't get along with management, would get fired, and finally, at the age of 24, came back home to Cape Girardeau to live with his mommy and his daddy. He then went to work in Kansas City, thinking, okay, I'm not going to make money in this radio business. Went to work for Kansas City in radio in 1979, but then was fired again due to conflicts with management. He then started working with the Kansas City Royals in 1979, thinking, okay, I can't make money in this radio business, so I'm going to get a real job. And that lasted for 4 years. He couldn't take it anymore, had to go back to radio. Found a job out west in Sacramento. And actually, he got a job replacing Morton Downey Jr. Remember that guy? He was one of the first big mouth shock jocks, okay? And basically, Limbaugh replaced him. And that's where he found his niche. A big mouth conservative talk show host. And actually, by the time 1987 hit, there was a law called the Fairness Doctrine that was repealed. Now, the Fairness Doctrine, if you remember, because the radio used public airwaves, the government said, okay, if you have a show that leans to the right, you got to have a show that leans to the left. You have to give equal time to equal people. So, basically, by this time, AM radio was all talk. Nobody wanted to listen to music on AM radio because you could listen to music on FM radio. FM radio had a much clearer signal than AM radio. Why would you listen to music on AM when you had FM? But the talk, because of the Fairness Doctrine, most people didn't want to listen to the left-leaning stuff, just the right-leaning stuff. So half the time they liked it, half the time they didn't, so nobody listened. With the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, stations could put on what they wanted. And in 1987, Limbaugh started his conservative talk show host show in Sacramento. By 1988, he was hired by WABC in New York, and he was syndicated by by Premier Networks. And by 37 years old, he had finally achieved success. He was an ESPN commentator on Monday Night Football. Remember that? And actually, he was on for several weeks until he made a Donovan McNabb comment. Basically, while it was probably pretty accurate, it's not a place for Monday Night Football. Monday Night Football is a place just for sports. And Limbaugh got political and racial, and they canned him. He was making $31 million a year by 2001. Then he signed a $400 million contract in 2008. By 2018, Limbaugh was the second highest radio show host in the business, second only to Howard Stern. He made $84.5 million in 2018. $84.5 million to talk on the radio. He was on TV. He had a television show for a while, if you remember. He did the Rush to Excellence tour. He's published books, but he's been married 4 times, divorced 3 times, no kids, and the same genre as Art Bell. He became addicted to painkillers. In fact, so much so, he became deaf. The opioids he was taking destroyed his hearing within a matter of weeks. But then he got a cochlear implant. which enabled him to hear again. But for a while, he